Time for this week's weekly challenge, and we're excited to have a very special co-host on with us. And that's Dan Brenneman has the challenge for us today. If you remember last week, Dan was like, oh man, we have to have Dan Klaus give the challenge this week. And so
I don't remember it quite being like that.
yeah, it was something like that.
We got to change it up. I mean, if we say very special and be excited, it would just kind of get old and dull. So we have to play that a little bit.
We try.
Yeah.
Well, you have a challenge for us today, do you not?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
This is a brief thing, and this is an unusual challenge, but it's from an unusual passage, I think. One of my favorite Bible characters is probably the oldest young man in the Bible, and his name is Elihu, and he's found in the book of Job, which is the oldest book in the Bible. And Elihu, I think, is an interesting guy because you don't really hear from him until he finally speaks up. He's kind of in the background, kind of silent, and then he speaks up. And when he speaks up, after he says what he has to say, then God speaks. And then the whole story, the whole lesson behind the book of Job falls into place. But just leading up to this, just to let you know what's happening here. Job, of course, has lost everything. God is allowing some trials in his life to take place so that God can use him as a lesson, use his life as a lesson. He has three friends who come by and try to tell Job, hey, the reason you're suffering is because you're not right with God. And Job says, no, I'm fine. I'm right with God. Even God said he was upright and escheweth evil in the book in chapter 1. But there was still something Job had to learn. God was trying to refine something in him. So finally, after 32 chapters, after 31 chapters, Elihu has been silent. He finally speaks up, and I'm going to read a few verses here of his reaction. And what we're looking at today, the challenge this week is to look at what do you do as a young person when you know more than than adults or those that have years of experience over you. What do you do as a young person when people that are older than you don't have the right answer, are not as smart as you even? But let's look at it in Job chapter 32. So it says, these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. And then was kindled the wrath of Elihu. And then going on after in verse 3, also against his three friends was his wrath kindled because they had found no answer and yet had condemned Job. Now Elihu had waited till Job had spoken because they were elder than he. When Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men when his wrath was kindled, and Elihu the son of Barachel and the Buzite answered and said, I am young, and ye are very old, wherefore I was afraid, and durst not show you mine opinion. I said, days should speak, and multitude of years should teach wisdom. But there is a spirit in man, and the inspiration of the Almighty giveth them understanding. Great men are not always wise, neither do the aged understand judgment. I remember in high school, there was a friend of mine, he would teasingly say his life verse was Psalm 119:99, where he says, I have more understanding than all my teachers. And it was just sort of a funny thing because he was a smart kid, and sometimes we didn't always have the brightest teachers at our school for some reason. But it's something that to point out here that there are times when, as a young person, you might have a better idea, or you might actually have the right answer as opposed to an adult who may have the wrong answer. Hey, I mean, we all grow up, and there's those that are straight D students, or the F students who grow up and they eventually have families, and they eventually will have jobs, and they'll be in positions of authority, and they just won't be that bright. So what do you do as a young person? Well, let's follow Elihu's example here. First of all, for the first 31 chapters, he was completely silent. He didn't say a thing. He was respectful to those who were older than he, and he even points that out. Even after his wrath is kindled, he got emotional about this because he had been sitting here for a week with Job and his friends in complete silence, all of them in complete silence, as Job was in a time of grief over losing his children and losing everything. And then when the three older men started speaking up, they didn't have an answer, and yet they thought they knew an answer. And it even God pointed out later in the book of Job that they were using these words without knowledge, basically. It was pointless, really. It was all vanity, as like in the book of Ecclesiastes. They were accomplishing nothing, yet saying profound things. So Elihu is listening to all this, and he's silent. He's respectful. Guys, even when we think we know better, it's best just to listen and observe and be patient before we step up and say something that we'll regret. Now, Elihu, he goes on to when he does speak up, he is respectful, and he says, I'm about to voice my opinion. I was careful to do that because I didn't want to appear, righteous myself. I didn't want to put myself above you as great older men. But you know what? Here's the point I want to make, as Paul told Timothy: let no man despise thy youth. You need to remain silent. You need to remain respectful for as long as possible. But when it comes to doing the right thing and saying the right thing, if you're in a position where, say, someone older than you is doing something completely sinful or wrong, there comes a time to speak up. When there is a time when you just know in your heart of hearts that some action must take place, then you need to know your place. And so when he does speak up, he points out there is a spirit in man, an inspiration, the Almighty. You may be young, but the Ancient of Days, if you're saved, lives in your heart. And if you can use this wisdom and use a godly approach to this, you can have your voice heard. You can say something. You can voice your opinion, but always know, as Elihu did throughout the next few chapters, because Elihu he breaks his silence and he speaks through Job chapter 32, even until chapter 36. I'm sorry, even chapter 37, and then God begins to speak in chapter 38. And this whole time, he begins to point out God. He's not slamming those that are in authority over him. He just says, I want to say what I have to say because you guys have forgotten about God. You've been trying to give out godly counsel and godly wisdom, but you're not considering who God is. Who has been God's counselor? Who can know the mind of the Lord? Even he said, and so he begins to point people in the right direction. So Elihu, he was silent, he was respectful, and then when he did speak up, his motivation, his priority was right, and that he made much of God and not of himself. And so, guys, when you're in a situation, and it's hard really to describe a specific situation, you may know what you faced. In my own life, there were times where I just thought, a teacher or an adult said something or did something and just didn't make sense to me. And I remember even my principal in school one time made a point about a biblical topic, and I let him speak. I didn't interrupt him, and he was giving someone an answer to a Bible question that I personally thought was wrong. And so after that student had left, I came to him silently, and I said to him, "Sir, when you said that, did you really mean this?" And he went on to say, "You know what? I said what I said because I know this person, their walk with Christ and their approach, and he didn't mean it to sound like the way I perceived it." So a lot of times, guys, when we perceive something that an adult is saying, we don't see the whole picture. And so it's best to be in reservation, be silent and respectful, and then voice our opinion, not to embarrass someone, not to make much of ourselves, and it's not about who is right, it's about what is right. Going to that person, approaching them with the truth, and being respectful and learning. It's okay that if you're wrong. It's okay when you get something wrong on your test, as long as you learn something. And we ought to be in that mode all the time to learn something. But there's occasions when someone else might be wrong, but we need to do that in the right way, and that is point it out respectfully and make God a part of that answer, that we are pointing things in the right direction. Dan, maybe do you have any ideas that how to use this information or how to utilize godly wisdom in a situation like that?
Yeah, that's good. That's a good challenge. And many times, as you mentioned, I would just say amen to what you said. Make sure that you understand the whole context of what you think you know better about, because sometimes we don't. Sometimes we feel like we know what's best, but we don't. And so it's always good to keep that silence. And even if you know better, even if you have the right answer and they have the wrong answer, your elder, respect them.
Right.
Always show respect. Even if they're wrong, show respect. And maybe that would open a door. If they're not saved, if they're not a Christian, that would open a door for you then to be able to share the gospel with them, because they say, wow, this young person respects me, and it shows respect. And that's not normal today for young people to show respect in that way. But like it says, I like that verse also, let no man despise thy youth. And a lot of times people despise our youth because we give them reasons to despise our youth.
Yeah, be an example of the believers, it
Yeah.
says too.
Yeah, and an example is that word example is to actually be someone that they could imitate. We should be imitatable. People should be able to imitate our life as a believer. And so good. That's a good challenge. Thanks, Dan, for that challenge. And let's live it out now. Let's take it this week and live it.